So, you know that weird feeling you get sometimes when things don't seem quite right? Well, I had that feeling when we arrived at the put-in point and I discovered that I'd left my two water bottles and food on the kitchen counter back home. How on earth was I going to make it through a 3-hour kayaking trip without either? Well, luckily, my spouse, who tends to be kind of nice, generously said that she'd share her meager supplies with me, but I was still angry for being so stupid. After all, I'd spent a significant time that morning making this really healthy sandwich and setting everything ready for me to go to make sure I was prepared, and I was really angry that I just wasted it all. I was going to have to throw away the sandwich when I got home. So, tried to get over that. I helped my wife get the kayaks down from the roof of the car, and then we stood around for about an hour and waited for latecomers to arrive. So my irritation for having been forced to get up really early only to get there and then wait was actually interrupted by our friendly and helpful guides talking about their previous kayaking adventures, which actually was pretty interesting. But it was one of those times where I began to feel very much out of my element. Sure, I'd kayaked numerous of times. It's one of those kind of resort vacation kind of things, or I'm at my in-laws and there's this sleepy little river and you rent a kayak and you kind of just mosey down it. But these guys were talking about rapids and sea kayaking and that kind of stuff. They were clearly the experts here, and I was beginning to feel kind of intimidated, although this trip wasn't supposed to have anything like that. Well, after an hour of waiting, we lined up to be helped into the water. Since the shoreline was a bit awkward, our guides were helping everyone into their kayaks and then kind of gently pushing them off. It was my turn, and I slowly lowered myself into this kayak that I've brought today. It belongs to the daughter of a neighbor, and if you know kayaks, it's obviously a little too small for me. Nevertheless, I stuffed my long legs and my above-average body size into this kayak and let them push me off. Immediately, I lost my balance and went under. In all my years of kayaking, so now I realize kayaking in quotes, I'd never tipped one. In fact, as we were preparing for this, my wife went out and bought this special kayak tailored to her. She went to Madison to get it. We even bought the Subaru so we could cart them somewhere. We were going to have this time together, and she even took lessons on kayaking at the Y and how to tip, and I'm like, I don't need any of that. I've never tipped. So as you can imagine, I came up as red as that kayak, and the guides asked me if I was okay while claiming that they probably just pushed me a little too hard. I climbed back in and gently made my way over to everybody else, the dozen or so kayakers that were waiting to set out. So one woman I noticed was kind of staring at me, and she asked me if this was my kayak. And I'm going to flip it over now so you can see it and you'll understand why. So this is what it says. It's got girl power, girl choir. Oh, yeah, isn't that beautiful? Oops. So much for the ceiling, right? Yeah. So yeah, it has girl choir and girl power stickers on it. So she was kind of looking at the kayak and looking up at me and looking down at the kayak and looking up at me. And I admitted it wasn't my kayak, and then I made up some excuse about grabbing the wrong kayak from my friend's house in the dark garage. I didn't want to confess the truth that I really didn't think about the size of kayaks. I didn't really know much about it, and I didn't know how I was really going to fit into it. So eventually, though, after that embarrassing moment, we started out. And I was really, really wobbly. Because of my weight, my kayak was just barely above the waterline. And I felt I was going to tip over just by paddling. I kind of looked like a rubber ducky in a bathtub, but even the rubber ducky, I think, has more buoyancy and stability than I did. Within the first 5 minutes, we came to the one and only rapids of the whole trip. It was this tiny little small waterfall that everybody kind of just slipped through and continued down the stream, including my spouse. But not me. I immediately tipped over again. And when I finally got upright and back in my kayak, almost everybody was gone way ahead. And now I was getting really, really angry and trying to figure out who I could blame, of course. And the conversation in my head was going something like this. This was all her idea. She wanted me to go on this kayaking trip to be with her because we never see each other enough. She should have known this kayak was too small and said something. Why did she leave me alone if she wanted to kayak with me? And by the time I tipped over again, for absolutely no reason at all, I asked one of the guides to go up and find my wife so maybe we could trade kayaks. By this point, I was pretty mad that she was in a larger kayak and had left me behind. Of course, I never said any of this to her. She graciously came back, switched with me, and then effortlessly tootled off to catch up with the others without ever catching a glimpse of how fuming and angry I had become and how it was building up inside of me. Now, there's something you need to understand about this trip. The guides had grossly underestimated the difficulty of this trip. It ended up taking 5 hours instead of 3. There had been a windstorm that people hadn't thought about, and there were a lot of downed trees in the stream, and the water level was extremely high, and sometimes obstructions were very difficult to get through. We often had to wait and go through impediments, single file, in this tiny little space, and then sometimes the current would sweep you sideways and prevent you from even getting through the narrow passage in the first try. So while you waited next to the shore, the current was pretty fast. You'd have to hang on to like a tree root or some grasses or something. The mosquitoes would feast on you. Yes, I forgot my insect repellent with my lunch on the counter. And then sometimes I needed to lean so far back in the kayak that the bark of the spider-infested tree was floating within inches of my face. So if you have this fear of spiders, it was not a trip for you. At one point, I'd had enough of those spider-infested trees, and I decided to portage my kayak around an obstruction instead of squeezing through it. I walked through a patch of nettles barefoot while pulling my kayak over land and then promptly overturned my kayak for the 6th time while boarding. Well, at least some of the oil from the nettles washed off while I was in the water. This was absolutely not the world of Beatrix Potter. Well, one of my guides took pity on me and offered to switch kayaks because he claimed his was more stable. I took him up on it, but my pride was so hurt that as soon as I got in that kayak, I sped up to put some distance between me and both guides as they were patiently helping another woman who clearly had no experience in a kayak. And I didn't want the guides to think that I was like her. I wanted to catch up to my spouse and the other good kayakers. So in my mind, this had come down as a challenge to my man card, and I had become totally self-absorbed in my own insecurity. Well, after paddling hard, literally hard, for 30 minutes, I found myself all alone, with probably no hope of catching up to the good kayakers ahead of me, and the guide and the other women were way behind me. The stream had now narrowed and was now a winding mass through a meadow of really tall grass, and I couldn't see hardly anything nearby. The grasses were about 5 feet over my head, and the stream's snake-like pattern prevented me from seeing at any time more than 20 feet in front or behind me. So there I was, just sitting in my kayak, kind of sulking, when I lifted my head and noticed that the sun was shining bright in one of those cloudless, crystal clear blue skies that you get every now and then in Wisconsin. There was no wind, and off in the distance, on a slight rise in the landscape, was a thick pine woods. Now, from my perspective, down in this grass, looking up, and I had sunglasses that by this point were all muddy and blurry, the trees sort of almost looked like a hazy, distant mountain range. And it felt like, at that moment, I'd been shaken awake to discover this glorious day. I had spent 3 hours so obsessed with my own self-pity and my anger and my ego that I'd completely failed to notice the beautiful gift that was all around me. Here I was in one of the most spiritually inspiring landscapes I had been in for some time, and that winter was particularly horrible, and then I had chosen completely to ignore it. So with this awakening at that moment, I felt relaxed, I felt the soft warmth of the sun and the air surround me, and a lot of my anxiety just disappeared. My spirit was lifted, and I swear I was almost physically transcended, as if I were floating in the air above this grassy area and looking down at me just in this meandering stream in my little image in the kayak. I gained a much different perspective and was humbled. And at that moment I was reminded how much bigger the world was than me and my little tipping kayak. Now, of course, there's many religious metaphors I could use to describe my awakening. Was it the hand of the transcendent Hebrew, Christian, or Islamic God that reached out and shook me to my senses? Was it the spirit of nature, represented by Gaia, Sky, Brother Sky, or another manifestation of the power of the universe? Or was it simply a miracle in my brain that caused the right biological reactions to change my perspective? You know, frankly, it really doesn't matter. What matters is my awakening to the great wide beauty of possibility and affirmation, and my gratitude for it. I was thankful just to be present in that moment, in those conditions, so that my spirit could really soar and I could rediscover a much healthier spiritual grounding. Well, as you know, religious narratives are filled with themes of awakening by their main characters. In the Jewish scripture, we hear about Moses in the burning bush, right? Moses was wallowing in his own self-doubt when suddenly God spoke to him through this bush that was on fire but not consumed by it. And then God convinced Moses that he was good enough to take the monumental task of leading the Israelites out of bondage in Israel to a new land. And then in the Buddhist holy scriptures, you have Siddhartha. He had a similar experience sitting under a tree, searching for enlightenment. After 49 days, he finally came to an awakening about suffering and its role in human consciousness. And this awakening led him to be a great teacher we call Buddha. And then in the Roman Catholic tradition, I can't help when I get into these nature stories to think about St. Francis. He, like Siddhartha, had been born into extreme wealth and, from what I've read, made the most of it in his youth. But he too had a humbling awakening experience. He acknowledged the suffering in the world and the interconnectedness of all creation, which set his life on a much different path. He became an ascetic, usually roaming the streets in rags, begging to bring him closer to the simpler, humbler elements of society. He became acutely aware of nature and found transcendence and a portal to the holy or to God through his environment. So all of these examples have something in common. An awakening from self-absorption to a fuller appreciation of the wider world and their place in it. Each changed the course of their life after their awakening experience. Although each awakening happened in relative solitude, they occurred in reaction to their surroundings and circumstances, often while they were sitting there pondering the big questions in life. Well, I'm not going to pretend that my awakening in this ill-fated kayaking trip ranks up there with Moses, St. Francis, or the Buddha. And I don't think it changed my life forever. In fact, it probably only for the rest of that trip that day. But it was an important reminder about mindfulness whenever I'm not spiritually healthy. This time it was the ego, frustration, and anger. Often, for me, it's due to obsession about the past. It's probably triggered by some loss or some grief. Somebody died or a relationship ended. And then I get into that endless loop of wallowing in depression, of the reluctance to accept the impermanence of everything, as the Buddha teaches us. I can become so self-absorbed by my loss that I'm completely oblivious to the joys around me, the people trying to love me, even the simple joys in life. Or anxiety and obsessions about the future. I think it's the too common malady of modern life. You can sit there and go, what's to become of me? Will I be happy? Am I going to be lonely? Will I be sick? Will I die before I fill in the blank? So I really like that chant that we did at the end of Joys and Concerns. And I often think about that. Sometimes I sing it to myself in my car, because as you know, I commute to both of my congregations. And it's this chant about being filled with loving kindness, but I love the phrase, may I be peaceful and at ease. May I be peaceful and at ease, because that is the necessary requirement for mindfulness and awakening to the world around you. And so like my day in that kayak, after I kind of ran myself ragged with my ego, I finally was at ease and able to be present in the moment, to be mindful, and look out and look at this landscape that to me was very similar to the poetry of Hafiz and the way it manifests in the world itself. My spirit soared just as his poetry does. He said, "Cloak yourself in 1,000 ways, still shall I know you, my beloved, if I only look up and am mindful from my kayak. I shall salute you in the springing of cypresses, and in the sheen of lakes, the laughter of fountains, even after overturning the kayak. O beloved presence, more beautiful than all the stars together, you gladden the whole earth and make every heart great. You are the breathing of the world." What a spiritual gift of beauty. Well, in case you're wondering, when we finally reached the end point of this trip, the guide that was helping me out said something like this: "Boy, that must have been tough. I've seen a lot of couples get in really bad fights over things like that." Well, I just shrugged my shoulders and said something like, "Meh," as if to convey, extreme humility. Inside, my ego was beginning to grow again, and I heard a voice saying something like, "But you don't know how good I am at rising above all that." So someday, perhaps, I'll learn the lesson of humility and beauty the universe was trying to teach me that day. May it be so. Amen.